Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a long-time progressive community organiser and activist, and I also happen to work in historical research, doing a lot of stuff adjacent to the history of social dynamics. Today, I wanted to begin with something of a personal story, and use that as a jumping-off point for a few general observations about the importance and role of demographic representation in the media we consume in our day-to-day lives. To start with, since I was in my early teens, I've identified as bisexual. In the course of growing up, I just ended up feeling attraction to the idea of being with both girls and guys, and some cursory research on my own part of why that was led me to find the right term to articulate that, if only to myself at the time. I say I'm bi because that's the term that fits, and I've had lovely relationships on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. Although nowadays that we're dealing with more than just the two genders I learned about growing up, if anyone asks, my go-to line has become, it's bi as in bimodal, not necessarily bi as in binary. These days, we've also got terms that functionally mean the same thing, like pansexual and omnisexual. And if you feel attachment to those particular terms, more power to you. I'm just going to stick with bi, since that's the label I personally started with, and any others would just feel like splitting hairs at this point. I couldn't tell you the exact date I first made the sudden realization that it was possible for a relationship to be different from just the storybook fairy tale one man, one woman norm, but I do remember exactly how it happened. One nondescript lazy afternoon, when I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, I was leafing through a bunch of these illustrated children's encyclopedias from the 50s. And several of the pictures I saw that day really left an impression on me. There were all these biblical-era rulers wearing flowering, bejeweled robes, and classical Greek philosophers in togas, and Roman centurions in what were essentially flappy miniskirts. And every king from the Middle Ages to the French Revolution was wearing not just some great big billowy colourful outfit, but also a bunch of jewellery and had a face full of makeup and silk stockings on too. It really made 12-year-old me really stop and think for a minute. And what I was thinking, that it was all, honestly, it seemed a lot fancier than the sombre stuff we call formal wear today. I might even have been able to write it off as the eccentricities of the elite from a foreign pagan culture in an age before the widespread adoption of real pants, if it wasn't for one other particular page towards the end of these books. The page in question was just a brief, sanitized overview of the American Revolution, and naturally it had a few pictures of the American Continental Army and its militiamen and some British redcoat regulars. That's what got to me. These redcoats, here you have these regular men. They're not royalty, they're not religious figures, they're nothing special. They're just whoever an 18th century army recruiter could tempt out of the Marlborough bread lines or pick up off a barroom floor somewhere to go get shipped off around the world in a bright red outfit to fight for king and country. And it was decidedly after the Anglo race had started spreading relatively modern norms and proper trousers and stuff like that. I immediately picked up on the fact that all of these tough, man's man working class soldiers all had shoulder-length, fully braided ponytails. In that instant, seeing this picture of an 18th century soldier's hair really put in my mind the notion that all our modern gender norms might just be made up and kind of arbitrary. Because previously, I just took it at face value that longer braided hair was a girly thing. But right here was an example clear as day that it hadn't always been. A few years on from that, I kept that sort of idea in my head, and having really always been interested in history, learnt more and more, and read about topics like what passed for normal intimate relationships among the ancient Greeks, all the way through to the recurrence of the historical prevalence for polygyny and everything that came out of the Renaissance buried under only the flimsiest pretext possible, as well as bona fide queer historical figures like Oscar Wilde and Lord Byron. I know it sounds a bit just so, but I think it's arguably fair to say that functionally, seeing those pictures put the idea in my mind, and seeing a redcoat's ponytail made me queer. That is the earliest possible impactful incident I can point to that began the snowball of me starting to think critically about gender identity and eventually sexuality. And it just so happens I've been getting back into that sort of thinking more recently. Maybe it's just because I spent a fair few months cataloguing ancient Persian artworks through the height of the Australian summer last year for my work, but I've been reflecting on how much sense something like skirts for men makes, and lamenting the fact that it's not more acceptable, because I absolutely would if I could get away with it in more reputable spaces. All that being said, this video isn't actually about that per se. If you'd really like to hear me talk more about gender norms and stuff like that, in particular directly, I'd recommend you listen to the video I did called Deconstructing Cisheteronormativity for Fun and Clout. I'll also link it at the top of the description if you want. What this video is about, broadly speaking, is why open quote representation matters, in everything from popular media to just plain being visible in everyday life. In respect really to all sorts of minority identities too, not just gender identity and sexual orientation related ones. Essentially, to that end, there's two reasons why we progressives say that representation matters. Consider this the concise explanation, both for anyone not yet on board with the correct side of the issue, as well as for any other leftists out there who have always been struggling to find the best way of explaining it to others. First and foremost, people, especially children, teenagers, and young adults, develop a large amount of their understanding of the wider world through the things they see, both consciously and subconsciously. In practice, this means essentially that seeing any positive portrayals of people who are like you in a way that has been historically marginalized can be very affirming. This can mean anything from making sure to include people of all sorts of marginalized identities in small everyday roles throughout all our stories in order to show that we believe everyone is welcome throughout our society, to explicitly featuring those sorts of marginalized identities in aspirational protagonist and hero roles. The media that growing people see every day, nowadays that's primarily stuff like TV and movies, is, for better or worse, invariably going to shape how people look at the world. This is one of the intended functions of art, and it always has been. Perhaps it's a bit hard to quantify in concrete terms, but the bottom line is we all benefit from seeing characters that are like ourselves portrayed as good people in the culture that surrounds us. Most people that have spent years yearning for those sorts of portrayals understand this fairly intuitively. But if you've grown up without having to wonder when or if you'll ever see someone who looks or acts like you on screen, that's a privilege. The most famous example, of course, the one that always gets cited by people making this sort of argument, which I'm also going to cite myself now, is something like Nichelle Nichols' turn on the original Star Trek, where she was perhaps the first time a black woman was shown on television in a prominent role of importance. It's something so theoretically simple to portray, but which evidently came to inspire countless girls of colour to hope for better in life back in the day. Nichols may not have been the first black female character ever, but she was one of the first few good ones. Representation doesn't just mean having characters of colour or some other minority identity just being played as comic relief by white actors in full-face makeup, or queer-coded characters only being portrayed as stereotypes and villains and so on and so forth. It means having minority characters that are actually something aspirational for people who might see the media they're in. It's that sort of thing. And when it comes to a lot of historically marginalised demographics, be they nationalities, cultures, disability statuses, gender and orientation identities, and what have you, there's still a lot of firsts that haven't happened yet. Unfortunately, a shockingly large amount of people still haven't had someone like them appear at all in essentially any mainstream cultural products. A lot of people just don't see themselves in television or films or literature or anything at all. And if you think that's not a big deal, or that it sounds like an unrealistic or entitled expectation to want that, we can tell that you yourself haven't been in that position. The other half of why representation is important is essentially because it shows everyone who isn't from a marginalised or minority identity that the people who are still matter. It's for, among others, everyone who, say, still gets mad when a non-white person is announced as the lead in a new movie or series. You know the type. They're the ones that usually cry something about wishing that people got roles based on merit rather than some imagined boogeyman of theirs. A sentiment I would call a reactionary dog whistle if I didn't think most of the time those people don't even realise properly why almost all the leads of their favourite TV shows and movies have been white men for the past 100 years prior. Those people haven't yet learnt their lesson, and apparently still need to be hectored publicly until they get it. To the people who are getting mad about that sort of thing, Western culture getting equalised feels like a loss of special status. And that's because, to people who before did have a disproportionate amount of space and privilege, being on a level playing field with everyone else feels like a step down. While, thankfully, we are arguably now just getting to the point where we have closer to fair representation, I think that's all the more reason we progressives should keep pushing. As much as any single person has virtually no ability to influence the cultural drift, as a consumer bloc, people, broadly speaking, can support particular trends towards inclusive media. Reductively speaking, if straight cis white men, if given the opportunity, they'll almost never seek out narratives that aren't made for, made by, and made about other straight cis white men. Maybe on occasion they'll go for something with a protagonist who doesn't fit exactly one of those descriptors, but that's definitely the exception, not the rule. With this in mind, if, as terminally online conservatives love to cry, minorities are actually getting an oversized amount of representation nowadays, I can't bring myself to care for their plight. If the left really has the power to make that happen, I say keep pushing until we hit complete saturation with it then. Get as much diversity of casting in every movie and every television show the average right-wing couch potato watches all their life. Worth mentioning too that video games are now, by some estimates, the biggest consumer product. Get in there too. If anything, the amount of unwashed chuds that came out of Gamergate a few years ago proves that on the whole, gamers still require a lot of work. Although we haven't yet gotten to the point where visible minorities often get near positions of power and influence at the level where art and culture is made, that's more or less just a waiting game. Until then, working on the representation problem can be a fun little project for us. And I'm not just talking about doing it to demoralise the reactionaries either. If you're an actual, avowed leftist, and you know that liberals are just the milquetoast managers of capital, you'll know they're far from being on the same team as us. Even when it comes from those with best intentions possible, liberalism essentially posits the biggest fault of bigotry is to deny minorities access to the open market. So feel free to turn that sort of pandering on them and run with it too. If at the very least they're going to offer progressives a visible platform for increased minority representation, we might as well seize it for whatever it's worth. Take up space, have fun with it. Be aggressively and visibly present. Best case scenario, it normalizes the outgroup just a little bit more. Now, important as representation for this purpose is, I'd prefer to focus primarily on the positive first type. So, returning to that idea, as well as that little personal story I told at the start of the video, I'd like to briefly address how representation of identities can impact an individual in practice. Basically, in opening people's eyes up to paths in life they might not have considered otherwise. A lot of what specifically comes to define our sense of self is pretty hard from settled science. I, for one, don't buy into the born this way narrative. I think people aren't just going to figure out what they want their identities to be without seeing some point of reference. It's exposure to these different ideas about what you can be that allows people to start thinking about more abstract concepts. Citing the idea of a picture you see once and then you're queer forever, for example, it might be a bit overly simplistic for some, but if it gets the idea across well enough, I think it's a good, albeit clickbaity, concept and title. Now, there's this conservative fear of a concept called social contagion. It essentially suggests that kids or teenagers are at risk of becoming gay or trans or whatever if they see it on TV or they hear about it in schools and so on. In a weird way, the conservatives have correctly identified a basic cause and effect relationship, although it should be said that they hugely exaggerate how prevalent turning gay or turning transgender is. Of course, I would take the position that exploring gender identities isn't bad. In fact, I'd say it's outright good. And so, on the whole, it's fantastic that people in that teenager to younger adult age bracket are now increasingly getting that message and being given the language and a frame of reference to begin thinking about those sorts of things for themselves. But someone who simply hasn't been exposed to the notion of deviating from a social default, whether it be related to gender presentation, sexual orientation, or even life and career prospects, or anything else entirely, they can't just magically come up with those concepts on their own. And in effect, or if you had to describe the process as a third party looking on here, it would appear as if the mere sight of someone who breaks away from those norms is single-handedly converting people away from the social status quo. The usual conservative line is they're corrupting the youth. But of course, I think it's good. Someone's identity, their traits, their lifestyle, isn't, I would argue, a predefined thing that they just need to discover, per se. It's an ever-shifting idea that can vary, even perhaps from day to day. And it's up to each person to create and define that for themselves. People, in aggregate and as individuals, are very adaptable. The post-Second World War white picket fence nuclear family shtick wasn't some primordial truth that just so happened to reassert itself among the baby boomer generation. The norms of 200 years ago, 1,000, 2,000, 6,000 weren't either. The possibilities are, in reality, endless, and your sociocultural truth can be whatever you want it to be, and that new truth can easily become society's new normal. We are, now fortunately, seeing this sort of come into effect. There is, after all, a reason why perhaps as much as 30% of Generation Z report being some kind of queer. It's not that almost a third of the people to come of age within the last 7 years has any innate biological difference or anything like that. It's just we're acknowledging that there's actually no reason to stick within the boundaries of open quote normal heterosexuality and cisgender norms, and thinking that has become much more normalized in the West. People are products of their society just as much as society is reflective of the beliefs and attitudes of the people which comprise it. If you raise a kid in a culture that openly tolerates non-straight romance, which is to say, just treats it normally, you're much more likely to get a queer adult down the line. In a repressive conservative culture, with less media representation of diverse personal identities, of course you'd end up with far fewer people being openly gay or openly trans and so on. If you could magically send a baby born today back in time to ancient Rome or medieval China or pre-Columbian America or anywhere else, they'd grow up understanding that culture as normal without needing to think twice about it. And I'd hope that down the line, we manage to create a culture that completely normalizes all sorts of identities and personal experiences. Because once you have it, people that are born into it will treat that as normal. And we get there in part by continuously pushing more and more for that meaningful representation, and keeping in mind how simply existing proudly and openly can inspire plenty of others who see us, young or old, to do the same. That's all I have to say today. Apologies it was a bit rambly, but if you might like to hear from me again, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page or take a look at my other videos. Goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.